Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, everyone who's just logged in. This is the first Current Briefings session of 2022, and we're going to talk about what the impact of the energy crisis is having on the capacity market. I'm joined today by Paul Verrill, who's Director at EnAppSys, who's going to kick off with a quick presentation to just run through the very exciting recent results of the capacity market auctions. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Hello to everybody. So the first slide, just a very brief introduction to EnAppSys. So EnAppSys is an energy data and consultancy business. We cover GB and Ireland and continental Europe. So we have a platform that provides data to market participants, kind of stakeholders, regulators, etc. So this data is provided live and covers kind of, it's predominantly electricity, but it includes kind of gas and carbon. And the majority of people are kind of using it to make decisions, so we call it decision support. And we also provide consultancy, so consultancy across GB and in Europe, and quite a lot of that consultancy actually is in the energy storage sector recently. So obviously lots of activity in that, but it's also covered kind of pump storage, longer term storage, the peakers, recip engines, CCGT. So pretty much the kind of whole range. I think in the early days we did a bit of nuclear when nuclear was kind of looking at the first new projects, but yeah, not so much nuclear these days. So do you want to give me the first slide? Thanks, Molly. So I thought I'd start off with a bit of an introduction, just so everyone's on the same page what the capacity mechanism is. So I've included at the top this taken from the AMR delivery body. So that link up there, if you ever want to kind of find out where the source data is or find about the capacity mechanism in the GB, then just type AMR delivery capacity mechanism. That will take you to the page where all of the kind of the data and some of the descriptions are. So capacity market is officially one of the key policies of the electricity market reform program. CM aims to ensure future security of electricity supply at the lowest cost to consumer. So it was brought in to address those two elements of the energy trilemma. We don't hear much about that as much, and it's kind of there, but it's something that was, we kind of talked a lot about. But the two elements it's looking for, as it implies, is affordable and available, and secure and reliable. So how do we have security and equally kind of manage the cost of that? So as renewable generation has very low variable operating costs versus conventional power stations, and in the main I mean fossil fuel power stations, they're very high in the merit order, which basically means they run first. And the subsidies provide a further merit order advantage. So because renewables and kind of low carbon options and nuclear is included in that, as it's got a very low variable cost, this results in reduced running hours and revenue for fossil fuel plant. And this is the missing or lost money, depending on kind of which website you look at. And this is effectively where you get insufficient revenue to cover your fixed and operating costs and any kind of returns that you need. So fixed and operating costs for existing power stations, and then also those investor returns that you would need in order to build a new power station, since anyone who's going to fund a new power station, would look for a reasonable return based upon the kind of risk of building that station. And left to the market alone, these assets or generating assets or low merit order assets would close. Any remaining assets would extract a high scarcity premium. So in the very limited hours in the future they would run, they would require a lot of money, and they would extract this kind of premium for generation. So the CM was designed as an availability payment. So you are paid to be there, and you're paid to generate in periods of system stress. So it's an availability payment to assets that can either increase generation, and this is significant, or else reduce demand. And that means that somebody who consumes a lot of power, if you reduce that power during a period of system stress, you can also be in a CM. To the right is a kind of a little diagram. It's actual figures, but what this is pounds per kilowatt revenue. And you can see it's an EnAppSys calculation from 2018 through to about 2040, well, actually through to 2050. And it's the revenue from a conventional gas turbine plant, a conventional gas plant at different efficiencies. So you can see 56%, 48%, 42, 38, 33. So that's generally the range of efficiencies across the fleet of gas-fired power generation. And then I've drawn a relatively simple line, which you could consider as a kind of a break-even cost in order to recover your kind of fixed costs, etc. And then the shaded areas are is the EnAppSys calculation of, it's just pure wholesale revenue. So there's additional revenues from CM, for example, balancing mechanism. So there's other revenues in the market, but this is a kind of a simple wholesale revenue. And you can see this missing money is the area below the blue line. So you can see that 2021-22, we're having it's a very good year for gas-fired generation. You can see, based on EnAppSys forecast as we currently stand, 2023 is not a brilliant year for gas-fired generation. And then you can see that over the next years, it does kind of climb to 2039, 40, where it starts to become higher again. And then it declines as renewables really come in. And by 2045, effectively decarbonized. I've overlaid on that the 15-year period. So effectively, when you're looking at the capacity mechanism, when you're bidding as if you're bidding as a new asset, you're looking to cover that kind of gap, that missing money. And then you also have to determine how much kind of revenue and returns, etc. That's the calculation they're doing. If you're an existing power station, you can only bid for 1 year contract. So you're only really looking at 1 year. And then I've superimposed on that the kind of green CM range. So you can see this is the capacity mechanism on the same basis. So we've seen it kind of vary from £6 up to this current high of £30. So you can see how the CM would lift that whole revenue and lift it above. So this main purpose is just to illustrate this missing money problem. As we come later in the presentation, it kind of explains when you're bidding in the CM, what you're really doing is trying to think of the future. But that doesn't necessarily apply. But Molly, next slide, please. So in terms of where we are, it's kind of pending 2025 results. As I did the presentation, obviously 2025 results were in, but we hadn't had time to kind of put all of the figures in and the T-1 figures. So this is prior to the T-1 auction that's ran and the T20 and the T4 auction. To the right, I've included National Grid's EMR delivery bodies chart showing kind of where it is. And you can see that the T-1 auction, which closed at the record-breaking £75 per kilowatt, and it can't be any higher than that. That's the capped price. You can see the T-1 auction in this 2022 year. So 2022, the arrow above there, you can see that lifted the capacity procured in 2022 to kind of very similar to what it was in 2021. And you can see the capacity from this latest auction is lifting the capacity up to the so above what the level we had in 2024. For those who kind of can read that chart, you can see the different fuel types in there. You can see the kind of one of the biggest deltas is this increase of interconnectors. So the capacity mechanism, interconnectors can participate in the capacity mechanism, and they are an increasingly large part of that. You can also see down the bottom the kind of light, the blue right at the very first series, and that's peakers. So from the capacity mechanism really brought forward a lot of peaker plants, generally gas recip engines, generally in the kind of 5 to 20 megawatt size, although we're starting to see 50 megawatt units and possibly bigger. So the capacity mechanism actually did change quite a bit of the different fuel mix that we have. And then you can also see the kind of slightly orange, which is the decline of nuclear, and then the complete absence of coal. So as coal in 2018, this kind of top brown section has phased out. So that's kind of where we are today. If you want to pull up the next slide, please. And the T4 auction. So kind of very quickly process the T4 auction to look at what that tells us. Just 1 second, I'm just going to get a document. So you can see that in the other is majority of the other is gas. So the kind of large blue on the side is a breakdown of gas from CCGT, which is combined cycle gas turbines. This is where we combine a gas turbine with a steam cycle, and that's where we get the maximum efficiency. Gas OCG is open cycle gas turbines, where we get lower efficiency. They can be often more flexible, and they can start a bit quicker than a CCGT. They have lower efficiency and they can be lower capex. And then we have combined heat and power, and then the gas recip engines, which are very similar characteristics to OCG, perhaps a bit more flexible. And the T4 auction, for those who kind of haven't seen it, it closed at £30.59. And in the next slide, we'll see the context of that, but it's the highest price we've had. Continuation of zero coal. We can't really have coal unless it's carbon abated, because the closure was brought forward to 2024, so that's not unexpected. You can see gas and interconnectors provided greater than 75% capacity. It's actually about 85%. So the majority of the system of the security provided in the GB market as of today and by 2025 comes from interconnector capacity and gas-fired power station. This auction has seen 3 gigawatts of new build batteries, including Intergen's 320 megawatt gateway batteries. That's probably the standout star of this auction, the gateway battery getting approval. And then we have Vitol's 299 megawatt Immingham open cycle gas turbine won a 15-year contract. So open cycle is that more flexible, slightly lower capex, lower efficiency gas generation. And 95% of the derated capacity is provided from existing assets. Next slide, please, Mike. So, energy crisis. I'm going to kind of bring the two threads together, and then we'll kind of start the question. I see some questions coming up, and Molly's going to handle these. So the energy crisis. What's been the drivers? So really, primary drivers is extreme gas and very high carbon costs. And I mean, I've been kind of around longer than I'll admit, but I've been around a kind of long time, and I often describe these current prices are just kind of like Martians have landed. We've never seen this sustained for these periods. So the whole world is kind of coming to terms with this. And on the right-hand side, you can see gas and you can see carbon. And for all of us who have to kind of pay bills, you can see that the forward market to 2026 has it coming down from the incredible highs we've been at, but still well above the kind of historic norms that we've seen for quite some time. So that is feeding into market views. On the bottom, you can see carbon. And what you can see on there is there's a dashed line and it turns into a solid line. And this is as we left Europe, GB had its own carbon mechanism. And unfortunately for us, or depending on your point of view, that carbon mechanism is actually more expensive in GB than it is in Europe. So carbon is even more expensive in Britain than it is if you were on the continent. But you can see with this rise of gas price, etc., we've had this big rise of carbon. So what's caused the kind of gas is low gas storage levels, geopolitical tensions, which just seem to get worse every day, unfortunately, and carbon markets. So we want to drive decarbonisation by increasing the cost of emissions. That drives the cost of carbon. But if the majority of your generation is still coming from fossil fuel sources, that's going to increase your power price as well. And then also we've seen this increased demand for gas from the COVID recovery, and then this transitioning of fuel from coal to gas to net zero. So we're getting where people are shutting coal. The other element I didn't put in there is that investment keeping pace with that. And it's a difficult call to invest heavily in fossil fuel when it's politically kind of difficult. Banks are put under pressure not to do it. But equally, how long, will gas be a primary or coal be primary fuel to get your return? The contributing factors, and these are kind of really key, because the energy crisis is the same everywhere. Carbon's slightly different, but in GB and actually in other countries, there's other contributory factors to this. An aging thermal nuclear generation fleet. So we've seen very poor availability from nuclear and certain large power stations in GB. So the capacity we thought we booked in the capacity mechanism hasn't necessarily been there. Poor interconnector reliability. So I think we've had some major outages on BritNed back in 2021. back in 2020 or the beginning of 21, and then the same with the IFA, the French interconnector. Cross-border interconnector arrangements, kind of don't like to mention the Brexit word, but we decoupled from the European market, which means that there is more friction at the borders for purely electricity. So there's a bigger price differential across the border than there would have been in the past. And then the missing money, because of aspects of the capacity mechanism, we've had this missing money that hasn't been balanced by the capacity mechanism, and we've had early asset closure or mothballs, and this has exacerbated the capacity crunch. Molly? So putting that all in, so the energy crisis driven the T1 auction closing price, so max of £75 per kilowatt, and has driven the T4 price to the highest ever. So in answer to the question, what has the energy crisis done to the CM? But record revenues in 2021, shouldn't this indicate better times ahead? So if you're looking at where you are now and you're not looking at an EnAppSys forecast, you think, well, good times arrived and they're going to continue, so therefore there's less missing money. But people don't always bid, so we're bidding, but there's also sentiment in there. That also has an effect. The thing that I kind of want to introduce the conversation is CM. Has the CM design contributed to the crisis? And I think you could argue it perhaps has. The aging plant derating factors in the CM are based on 5 years prior. So by the time you get to the year, you're actually, the classification of how secure they are is based upon where they were 5 years ago and not where they are now. Interconnectors are counted as generators, but they're actually dispatched by others. Low CM prices in previous auctions have led to assets leaving. So the capacity crisis is kind of 21-22, this crunch, and you can see it coincides with some of the lowest CM prices in this period. So this period gives the lowest CM prices we've seen in the past, and then some assets can't survive with those and they've left the market, and now we kind of run out of capacity a little bit. Due to design, calling a stress event has never happened. Could discuss that one if anyone wants to know more about that. And first introduction of CM, some of the aspects of bringing the CMs, it changes, unintended consequences, which is the bane of the energy market. And now the final slide. Okay. And the final slide is, what is the impact of the energy crisis? In very quick summary, it increases the auction closing price due to reduced market participants. So there's kind of this capacity crunch means there's less people prepared to, or less people in a position to win a CM contract, but also the kind of concern of the energy crisis means the government wants to buy more capacity. So you put those two together, it's a supply-demand balance, supply reduces and demand increases, the price rises. And then what I would say is perhaps the other question, what contribution did the capacity mechanism make to the energy crisis? I'd argue it has impacted it a bit. So there is some of the increased prices we see are due to aspects. So aspects of the designs increase this capacity crunch and led to more scarcity premiums in the market, particularly interconnectors. And if they're not on, then you have a problem. And other CM designs manage peak prices. So other capacity mechanism designs, if I give you an availability payment, they also cap the scarcity upside, and we don't. So Irish CM is one of those. So that's the kind of end of my presentation. So happy for Molly to kind of ask any questions and media any questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. And we've had a couple of questions in, but if there is anything else that other people want to ask, please just stick it in the box. So to start with, Chris Dunham has asked, how reliable are interconnectors when they're not a specific generation plant? If it's not windy here, then it's probably not windy elsewhere in Northern Europe. So that generation capacity will presumably be needed where they're located.
I mean, the interconnectors, in a normal market design, the flow follows price. So you're right, if there was a scarcity, and then the problem when you get lots of countries with their own capacity mechanisms, their own economics, then it becomes a fight. Who's got the right prices? So you would probably argue that interconnectors should follow the stress period. So if we're under stress, our prices are high, then they should bring power through to us. If that happens in conflicting countries, it's not guaranteed. So I would say that they've had bad reliability, physical reliability. Now, maybe that's just the design and that, they're a relatively new technology, that the extent we're using it at the moment, but it will follow the market price, not necessarily who's got a CM contract. That's probably the main issue. There's no contractual obligation for people to deliver, for a generator in Europe to deliver power to us in a stress event.
I think Tim Thornton's question was along the same sort of lines of, do you think protectionism from Norway to maintain cheap local supply is going to reduce interconnector supply from them? But that's pretty much covered by what you just said, I think.
I'd say very quickly, the Norway one is an interesting one because they have kind of limited the capacity they're prepared because it's causing issues for their prices. But the capacity mechanism doesn't recognise that, as in it recognises their physical capacity and historically what an interconnector has done. So yeah, it's a bit of a mismatch.
You mentioned towards the end of your presentation whether or not the design of the CM needs to change in the future. I wonder if you could expand a little on that and what changes would be needed to address some of the issues we're seeing currently.
I think they are looking to, I mean, there's consultations at the moment. I've seen one recently. So I think probably one of the main consultations is derating factors. So they've used a very broad brush with derating factors. In the early days, all storage was derated based on pumped storage, so whether it was a 1 hour or 4 hour or 5 hour, and then they moved to derating storage on an individual. But then when you look at assets, so interconnectors will be their derating factors determined on a history, but if they haven't got a history, then you would use similar assets. So I think that one of the things that's highlighted to them is this kind of getting the derating factors, otherwise it can be a false security. So I think that's one of the more radical areas of looking at. The problem is now we've embarked on a CM, so radical areas like using the Irish model where you cap the peak prices, I think that would be difficult to do. So I think the kind of derating factors is the areas they are looking at. That's probably the easiest area, and they would hope that would address it. They have over the years also changed things like the penalties for non-performance and the increase of deposits. So that has had an effect on making it more difficult to not fulfill your contract.
And has the CM worked in addressing the trilemma issues?
I mean, sometimes it has and sometimes it hasn't. I think whenever, so for us who kind of model, and I have to kind of look at things, you look at why does the market do various things. My best explanation is that we've got transition work going at a pace, and the pace of that isn't always necessarily, the government can't dictate that, you know, private sector has to build these things and when they decide to put them online, etc. So you've got the energy transition happening at one pace, and then you've got the kind of transition from the old world where those closing. Every now and again they get out of step, and we've seen that in 2016 where the coal stations closed before the government would like them to. So what I think will happen is we're going to have these kind of peaks and troughs for a while until everything kind of becomes balanced, and it's basically where one thing gets ahead of the other. I mean, it was interesting when we had the COVID 2020, we effectively seen the UK jump 5 years forward in its fuel mix, and then what you found is that grid had a lot of problems with grid stability and had to run a lot of thermal plants to keep inertia, etc. So it was, in that respect, it was good because it gave them a kind of look what the future looks like. But it's very difficult. There's a lot of moving parts to keep them aligned. So the lights haven't gone out. So yes, it hasn't kept the costs within affordable because of the gas. So it just shows that there is other things out there that aren't in your control. I think it could do a better job of doing it.
The next question is from Simon Parrish, who asked, how do you see UK battery energy storage capacity playing into the CM now and in the future with long duration batteries if they are developed?
I think that, I mean, other battery developers can kind of comment, but I can give you my kind of view is that I don't think battery developers develop for the CM. So because they're so derated, I think that roughly they will only get 30% of that £30 for £10, you know, and you're going to need 40, 50, 60, 70 pounds per kilowatt to get a battery economic. So £10 is a good contribution, but it's not going to be the thing that decides what you're going to do. So I don't think batteries, short duration batteries, will be built for the CM. Long duration batteries, yes, it obviously is a more significant, but they're equally a more significant capital cost. So I don't think storage massively looks at the CM market. Going back to the other question, I mean, one of the interesting things is we may see these kind of flexibility type contracts coming in, where effectively you're paid for your flexibility in what you can do for the system on longer term agreements. So things like Stability Pathfinder, they're the types of things that I think will probably drive long-term storage. And I think Molly and I talked before this call, I'm kind of a strong believer in long-term storage on a cap and floor type mechanism.
So another question from Chris Dunham, do you see the CM value rising to reflect the cost of the recently announced 2035 zero carbon grid target and presumably the need for abated firm capacity?
I think so. So for those who kind of follow the market, that when the market was created, there was this concept of cost of new entry, which I think is £49. So the idea is that, and the cost of new entry is based on the OCGT, or a simple cycle. So the belief was that you need £49 per kilowatt in order to build and get a reasonable return. So at £30, you can see we're still quite away. So there's still quite a bit of headroom in the capacity market price for it to go higher. And in other countries, it is higher. The one problem with being in a position where you have to forecast the market is there's fundamentals, there's calculations, and then there's sentiment. The sentiment is always the hard bit. I mean, if you look at the capacity mechanism, there's not many big new CCGT plants came forward, and the older CCGTs are starting to kind of get tired and worn, and we are going to need them. So my belief would be that the new CCGTs have taken a view that the price will rise from here and that they shouldn't take a contract this year. So I expect the price to rise, and then you'll come to a point where a lot of new capacity is built, and then the CM will drop back down, so just sustaining a certain existing plant. There is some plant in the market, in my opinion, won't close down. Pump storage, Denovic, etc. They're not necessarily in it for the CM. So they're more price takers than kind of price makers. So once the price takers are setting the price, then it will drop again. So I expect it to continue to rise, but don't quote me next year when it doesn't.
The next question is from Sean Ritson, which says, what is the levelized the LOLE standard and VOLL set to currently in the UK?
I don't know. I can't answer that off the top of my head. If Molly can kind of pass me the details, I can send you a reply to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's again a question that we've touched on a little bit, but will the CM approach be required in all markets, and does it need to change the way the market operates?
I think that any market that is decarbonising is looking and will need some level of CM, and it becomes a bit like an arms race in a way that if you're connected to another country that's got a CM mechanism, and it basically all your power stations contract with that, then what are you going to do? So once somebody starts with it, it kind of feels that everybody will have to have one to an extent. What does it do with the markets? It's an interesting. I think I've had this debate with kind of fellow consultants. As you could argue that it's a fixed payment that you get, and it doesn't really change your behavior in the market. But I think it does. I think that there's a psychological effect. Like, we'd all be the same if we had all of our living expenses paid and we were still getting some money. We probably would take more risks than we would otherwise. Whereas when you're kind of living hand to mouth, you're going to do, you're basically not going to take risks with income. So I do think it changes the risk profile in the market depending on how much you're receiving in the capacity mechanism.
Fantastic. I think it's just turned past on the dot, so I'm going to call the session to a close there. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us for the presentation and for answering the questions. A recording of this will go up on Current in the next couple of days, possibly at the beginning of next week, and the next Current briefing session will also be announced hopefully in the next week or two. If anyone has any additional questions, though, just drop me an email and I'd be more than happy to help. But yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to join us, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye.